Welcome. So this is the just a quick presentation I'm going to do as to cover the respiratory system. The first bit's going to be quite a sort of quick gun through because we covered a fair bit in class. So I'm going to sort of, without further ado, just introduce the grading criteria. So we're working towards the P6M3. So this is to describe the structure and function of the respiratory system, and it's going to be followed in fairly quick succession by the section on analysing energy systems. So we're nearly there with this anatomy unit. So let's crack on. So a lot of this was covered in class. So this picture just gives a quick overview of where the system is. So you can sort of see on the left hand side we've got a nice picture with the breathing muscles attached. You can see this sort of intercostals between each of the ribs, and on the right hand side we've got this nice picture of the sort of internal workings of that respiratory system. So the first thing to draw your attention to is this labelling here of the upper respiratory tract, and just look at where it cuts off just below the larynx, and then we've got this lower respiratory tract there. So you can already make that sort of distinction. That top half contains our kind of main sort of filtering mechanisms. The bottom half contains all the sort of pipe works that get it to where the sort of main gas exchange happens. So we'll just forward a couple of this ones really quickly, so you could just sort of get a nice picture of how the lungs are not entirely symmetrical. So if you look at the, I'll sort of do a big figure. This lung here on the person's left hand side has got a slight little indentation. So we see this bit here is where the heart will sit. So the left lung is ever so slightly smaller, and you can see that, you know, if you're looking to make observations, you can see there's a slight difference in the way that those two bronchi are angled. So they're not entirely symmetrical. On the left hand side you can see where the lungs sit relative to the heart, so you can sort of see them sitting either side. As we move on, this picture is a nice sort of overview of the sort of general scheme of gas exchange. So if you just sort of follow it around, if you go from the 1 to 6, you can see the oxygen entering the blood at the alveoli is going to be highly concentrated in oxygen, and that gets drawn into the blood, which at that point is very low in oxygen concentration. You can see the blood gets pulled or sort of taken back to the heart, number 2, via the pulmonary vein, and then it's pumped to the body. And then at number 3, the oxygen starts diffusing into the body's cells. The cells use it to do their work, their respiration, and they kind of give back carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide on the left hand side of that picture comes out of cells, is transported in the blood, either bound to hemoglobin or as a sort of bicarbonate molecule, and it finds its way back to the heart, where it then gets pumped to the blood, so the alveoli, to lose its carbon dioxide and get more oxygenated blood. So the class task we gave was this one here, which most people managed to get done, which is to read the first respiratory system page in Stafford Brown and answer how many breaths we take on average per day, asking which lung was slightly larger and why, how many terminal bronchioles there were, and how many alveoli there were. You were then asked to fill in page 34 in your workbook, which is a labelling task, and the picture wasn't ideal, but hopefully you managed to find your way in. And then you're asked to fill in just these 4 sections of your workbook, which is the nasal cavity, and I want you to use those words that I've attached when you're describing how that sort of structure influences the function. So you're asked to describe the structure, but really you need to show why that structure is the way it is. So you can say, for example, the nasal cavity, its function is to warm, moisten and filter the air, it works as air is passed over things called conchae, which are essentially shelves behind our nasal cavity, which are very vascular. They help warm, moisten and filter the air as the air is passed over these sort of thin conchae, which are made up of very sort of capillary rich tissues, which also contains a lot of sort of goblet cells to create this sort of mucus surface. So you can sort of shorten what I've just said. So you're looking at trachea, looking at bronchus, and then bronchioles. So this is the nasal cavity for those that want to have a closer look. So you can see at the front, I'll draw some hairs in there. There we go, a big hairy nose. So the first sort of filtering mechanism is our nasal hair. And nasal hair will just sort of filter out big particles. So breathing through the nose passes air, either these conchae, and it's passed through very capillary rich tissue, which is also covered in goblet cells. They warm, moisten and filter the air and kind of prepare it for the lungs. Because if you think, one of your bits of research would have identified that we have something like 600 million alveoli, so they must be incredibly minute, so very, quite vulnerable to damage and really extreme changes in temperature. So that sort of process of preparing the air, filtering out particles, is really important for our respiratory health. So there's another picture. You can see these conchae again. So again, air comes in here, it's passed through there, and down. There we go. It goes up here, and it passes, and down. So, these are nice pictures just to summarise the key differences between the trachea and the bronchi. Again, this is something that we covered quickly in class. So we're talking about how the trachea is C-shaped rings of cartilage. Behind the C bit sits the esophagus, which is your food pipe. So the C-shaped rings of cartilage here kind of resist that crushing, and they're quite a wide tube for air to pass through. As they come through, they branch into the left and right bronchus. So these are slightly smaller tubes, but still really essentially just an airway. Now they have rings of cartilage which keep them open all the time, but they also have a relatively thin, smooth muscular wall, and that substance can try and constrict ever so slightly, but not quite as much as these secondary bronchus. Can you see how now, as we move down to here, the sort of blue cartilage is now a little bit more. It's a terrible picture. It's down here where that green blob is. There's a bit more of a sort of plate. So this kind of helps give the lungs a degree of elasticity, but it does mean that when that smooth muscle constricts, it can limit blood flow to a certain extent. So things like asthma will be a sort of inappropriate sort of reaction your lungs take to a perceived threat. So maybe sort of chemicals, maybe dust, even some sort of bugs, can cause a sort of spasming of those muscles, which make it very difficult to get air in. So I'm just going to let my dog out. Come on, sausage. Oh, off you go. There's a good girl. So you can see that whole sort of bronchial tree gets smaller and smaller until we end up at the sites of gas exchange, which are the alveoli at the bottom. And we'll discuss those, I think it's in the second presentation. I'll go through those in a bit more detail. So this picture just quickly illustrates the diameter of the various blood vessels. So you can look at the diameter of the trachea, 15 to 22 millimeters, the bronchi 10 to 15, and then you go right the way down and you see that at bronchioles you're sort of less than a millimeter wide. So absolutely, sort of tree gets smaller and smaller. So that might be worth sort of mentioning in your essays of describing the structure. We talk a little bit about the airway epithelium, that should say have a Y at the top. So if we can imagine, just let me orientate you. So if we look at this picture of this chap looking left, this guy, and what you can see is there's a big arrow pointing out from a section of his trachea. As we look at his section of trachea, what we can see is it's sort of picked out a few of these cells. So if you follow this arrow, I'm just putting a green blob in at the minute, it goes on to show the sort of cellular structure. And there's two really important things we've got here. So if I draw a big green blob around the nucleus, oh, there we are. Let me do that slightly bigger. There we go. Oh, it's gone orange. There we go. Green. There we are. So I'm just colouring in this epithelial cell green. So the cell is there. But do you see these little hair-like projections at the end? These are called cilia. C, so stop, I, L, I, A. That didn't really work. So these are called cilia. There we are. Cilia move stuff. I can stop it. So what they do is they kind of move. They sort of tickle sort of debris and gunk outside of the lungs. So dust particles get trapped in mucus. So the mucus is created. There we go, orange. So I'm just colouring in the mucus cell orange. So what you can see, that mucus will exit that cell and it sort of covers the surface of those cilia. So the mucus kind of creates that moist environment which helps trap sort of dusty particles. And then the cilia help to sort of tickle it out of that respiratory system. I mean, they're absolutely minute, but that covers all of that respiratory tract. So wherever you see ciliated epithelium, it's these little hair-like projections that can tickle sort of particles and debris out of our respiratory tract. And one of the things that happens when people smoke is that the cilia actually get disabled. So you kind of lose whatever filtering mechanism you did have. And sometimes when people kind of stop smoking, then the cilia sort of slowly start to rework. They often get these real hacking coughs, much worse than when they were smoking, and it's a real sort of it's a sign almost that the respiratory system is kind of waking up again. So I'm going to get you to research. I just literally want the sort of functions of these sections. So the epiglottis is really just a flap of sort of cartilage that separates the esophagus and the trachea. The pharynx is the back of our throat. I don't know what else to say about it really, but if you ever get pharyngitis, it's your sore throat. Laryngitis, if you ever get laryngitis, you kind of lose your voice because your larynx is your voice box, and it contains your vocal cords. And then lastly, the lungs as a whole. So in your workbook, I'd like you to just complete page 35 for me. So just pause the presentation, find definitions in your Stafford Brown book, and stick them in. So as we crack on, I don't know anything about that one. Your questions from part 1 were these. So how many breaths a day do we take on average? How many bronchi do we have? How many times do the bronchi divide? How many alveoli do we have? What is the name given to the process of drawing air into the body? And what shape is the diaphragm at rest? So have a quick go at answering those questions. I think you should maybe be getting there by now. And there's your answers.